So now we're up to installing our camshafts. When we install the camshaft, there's a number on the bottom. Sometimes there'll be a dot on the top. If there's just a number, place the number on the bottom. If there's a dot, place the dot on the top. Or another way to remember is keyway is going to face up. I'm just going to lubricate my bearing surfaces. And I'm also going to squirt a little bit of oil in my bearing surfaces in the cam box. Once the cam's in, just make sure it turns freely. You should have already taken all of your bearing clearances. And I'm just going to sit there with the number down, dot facing up. And I'm just going to do the same on the other side. A little bit of oil on the cam box. Now when you slide these in, you just want to make sure that the cam lobes as they go through the bearings do not score or damage those bearings. You just want to make sure you wipe any oil that got onto the gasket surfaces off. Okay, so we're going to go and install our camshaft retainer. So we've got the retainer, gasket, and an O-ring. Gasket goes in clean and dry. Do not use any sealant here at all. You've already flattened this surface on the cam box when you serviced it. And on the bearing surface, if you're reusing them, I've gone ahead and flattened that first. So I've got my O-ring. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to apply the O-ring to the camshaft retaining plate. Then I'm going to lubricate it with some silicone paste. This is going to help install the O-ring, and it's also going to help act as a preservative. No sealant should be used in any part of this system here. So once I'm lubed up, go ahead, take my gasket, and that's just going to sit right there. And I've got my fastener, and I'll use the top bolt to kind of line everything up so that way I can get it in there, and then I'll bring in the other bolts. Okay, when you line everything up, you should be able to push the camshaft retainer in with your fingers. You shouldn't have to pull it in with the bolts. And then your bolt should screw in with your fingers with no effort. Just going to nip them down, and now I'll torque these down to 10 Newton meters. And I'm just going to do the same on the other side. So once you've got the cam thrust plates in, just check that the cams rotate. They should be nice and smooth and rotate freely just with your fingers. Everything should be floating on a bed of oil. And then what we're just going to do is, if they've moved during your initial setups, just make sure that the part number is on the bottom and the dot is on the top. So next we're going to put our thrust washers on. Our thrust washer has a taper on the inside edge. That taper faces the camshaft. So it's going to install like this, and that's going to push all the way back on. We're going to do the same on both sides. So next we're going to put our shims. Now I normally start with 3 shims per side, and we'll measure our chain depths to adjust that. but 3 is a good starting point. So you just want to slide those 3 shims, and these are just the alternator shims as well. Slide those on. For right now, we're not going to put the keyways in. I'm just going to take my camshaft vernier, and I want to slide that on all the way until it bottoms out. Pull the camshaft back, and then make sure you push it in to seat it there. Do the same on both sides. Next, we're going to put our timing gears on. And on a 1 through 3, the dish is going to face forward. And we're not going to hook it up onto the timing chain for right now. We just want to sit it on. On the 4 through 6, the dish is going to face in towards the engine. Next, we're going to take our wave washer and our nut and screw that onto the cam. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to support my cam, and I'm just going to tighten up the camshaft nut. I'm not going to torque it down at this point, because all we want to do is check our chain depths, and to do that we just need to have all of the slack taken out of the system. So I'm just going to kind of give that a little nip, and then if you grab your camshaft, you should only have about a 1/2 millimeter of end float back and forth, and it should still turn freely. So the first thing that I need to do when I'm setting up my chain depths, and what the chain depth is we need to align our camshaft sprockets with the timing chain gear that's mounted on the intermediate shaft. So the first thing I'm going to do is, I've still got my intermediate shaft cover off. I take my set of vernier calipers, and I'm going to push it in until I contact the timing chain gear, which is going to be for the 426, and then I'm going to take a measurement off this case of how deep that gear is, and we are at 51.74 millimeters. So what we need to do now that we know this measurement is we need to extend this housing over to this point so we can take that measurement. So what I'm going to do first is, I've got my straight edge here, which I'm going to use to extend this housing surface over to that gear, is I need to go ahead and measure how thick this piece of straight edge is. And it's 25.4 millimeters is going to be the thickness of this. So I'm just installing a straight edge holder. You don't have to have one of these tools. It makes it nice because it holds your straight edge nice and flush up against the housing. You can, if you want to, just use a regular straight edge and hold it, but then you've got to balance one hand holding, the other hand while you're taking your measurements back here. So what I've got to do first is I'm going to add my bar measurement thickness to my gear measurement thickness. So our gear measurement was 51.74 millimeters. Our bar is 25.4 millimeters. That gives us a depth of 77.14 millimeters is the optimal depth. It should be from this point to this point. Now the specification on this is plus or minus 0.25 of a millimeter. So I'm just going to take my depth gauge, and I like to use a long depth gauge because it keeps me nice and flat and parallel. You also don't want to put a lot of pressure on this bar because you can flex it in. And I'm going to measure, this one is at 77.11 millimeters. So that is within 0.03 of a millimeter of our intermediate shaft. So 3 shims is the perfect shim pack for this side. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing on the next side. So I'm going to transfer the bar. We need to do a little bit more math because the second drive gear is back, but the Porsche factory manual is going to give us this dimension. We'll do our math and then we'll go ahead and measure this one and see where it's sitting. So Porsche gives us a dimension of 54.8 millimeters from gear to gear inside. So if we add our previous dimension, our previous number we had from bank 4 through 6, The optimum depth that we want to be at is going to be 131.94 millimeters. So when we come in here and we measure this one, I just want to make sure everything is nice and straight. We're getting 132.77 millimeters. So we're effectively about 0.83 of a millimeter too deep. So that means we need to shim this one out to get it as close as we possibly can. It's not going to land right on the exact number because of the shim size is limited to 0.5 millimeter shims, but we'll get it a lot closer and then remeasure it. So we're just going to add one shim and see where we end up. Just slide that back in. And then I'm just going to go ahead and remeasure and see where we're at. And we're at 132.08. So we are approximately 0.14 off of our design dimension, which is well within the 0.25 specification range. So 4 shims is all it needed. So now I've set my chain depth. I need to go ahead and undo each one of these nuts. We need to add our keyway for the camshaft, and then we can go ahead and get our chains on and set our cam timing. So we're going to go ahead and install our keyway. This is a Woodruff key for the camshaft. So the way I install that is I'm just going to carefully reach in. We don't want to drop that. So once I've got the keyway sitting there, I usually use a pair of Nipex to just gently push that down into the groove. And what I'll normally do to make it a little bit easier is on the front edge I'll let it on a slight angle down, so when I take my cam vernier gear it'll make it a little bit easier to start, and then as the gear pushes on it'll settle out that keyway. So the first thing we're going to do before we start putting our chains and connecting everything up is we want to make sure that our engine is on TDC. So I'm just going to take my wrench, and I've got my Z1 mark, and my Z1 mark needs to be lined up perfectly with my crankcase center. If you've got the fan housing on it, you'll see the fan housing will have that notch on it too. So the next thing we want to do is we're going to stretch out our chain, and we want to go ahead and put our timing gear in. So you want to pay attention, make sure that it is in the correct facing direction. And for right now I'm just going to sit that on there, and then I'm going to take my timing chain guide block and install that. Then what I'm going to do next is just make sure my wheel's seated. I'm just going to press down on the slack side to take all the slack out, and we're going to take our idler wheel, lubricate our post, and slide that on until it's engaged. And on your idler wheel you should have the little lubrication bucket facing up. So I'm going to do the same on the other side. I'm just going to pull my chain up, make sure my gear is facing the correct direction. And at this point it doesn't matter really where the chain is. We just want to lift up on that and take any of that slack, so we want it tight on our pulled side of the chain. I'm just going to install a dummy chain tensioner, and all these are going to do is provide pressure on the chain. So I'm just going to slide these up. You never want to leave these in. I've pulled down a lot of engines and found dummy chain tensioners set up in there for full-time running, and that's about the worst thing you can do. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take my timing pin and I'm going to find an open spot in the wheel where I can fit that pin in. Then I'm going to do the same on the other side. So I just want to get down, take a look, find an open spot, and go ahead and slide that in. When you slide it in, make sure the threads are facing out, otherwise you'll have to take the whole gear off to get it out again. So once I've got my pin in, I'm just going to go ahead and screw the nuts on. And these don't have to be real tight right now. So now what I've got to do is I've got to get in an intake rocker on both sides. So to do that, just to make it a little bit easier, I'm just going to tilt the engine, lock my stand, and then we're going to go put a rocker in. So the first thing I'm going to do is lubricate my camshaft just with regular old engine oil. These engines don't need a fancy cam lube. You can use one if you want, but it's not necessary. Then I've installed the RSR rubber O-rings. These help seal the rocker shaft, so I want to lubricate those with silicone grease first. Then the way that this shaft is installed is important. We have the 5mm Allen head screw on one side. That needs to face into this cavity, because if it's in this cavity, we can't check it on a regular basis. Also, the distance that these are installed is important. This is probably one of the most screwed up things that I find when I pull engines down or I service them. The thickness on this boss here is much thinner than this one. The correct placement of the rocker shaft is so that you should just be able to see this very fine edge proud of this edge. What I find a lot of people do is they try to center the shaft, so you'll see this side is buried in too deep, and what will happen is you can actually, I've seen them in so deep where the rocker shaft will start wearing on this groove, and that'll chew out the bearing in your rocker shaft. It'll also make this housing prone to leakage, so it's important that you get it in the right place. So to install these, I'll usually just kind of get them started without the rocker in. And a lot of the time it'll help to use a screwdriver on the back just to kind of hold it in the right place. And you just kind of want to get it started right about there. My serviced rockers, going to lubricate the pad as well as our bushing. You'll see that I've also got the adjustment screw backed off all the way. And I just want to slide that in until it's sitting there. There will be a little bit of preload on the rubber sealing ring. And so I'll just use my screwdriver to get it in and started. And once I'm in, I should be able to press my shaft in. This is where we don't want to press it too far. So it should sit right about there. Okay. To go ahead and tighten these up, I've got an 8mm Allen wrench on the back side and a 5mm Allen wrench on this side. And right now what we want to do is just take up the load. And these are going to be fairly tight, because what they're doing is, as you're tightening down this shaft, it's actually expanding the rocker shaft so that it grabs and pinches against the outside of the cam box. These also need to be rechecked at every time you do a valve adjustment. You should be checking the rocker shaft torques. So next I'm going to go ahead and set the valve clearance, and this is one of the very important parts of doing the cam timing, is making sure that your valve clearance is set correctly, because if your valve clearance is not set correctly, then your cam timing is not going to be correct. So the next thing I'm going to do is install my Z-block with my dial gauge, and this is a metric dial gauge, and I want to make sure that I've got a long pointer on my dial gauge so it can reach down and sit on top of the retainer for the valve, because we're going to be measuring the valve movement. So you want to make sure that the dial gauge can move up and down freely. You don't want to have it pinched up against the side of the cam box. You also want to have it as far over as you can, because as this rocker comes down, it's going to pivot somewhat. And then we want to just go ahead and tighten our retainer down so our Z-block doesn't move around. Everything has to be fairly rigid to make sure this operation is done correctly. Okay, so once you've figured out what your cam timing is, and the way that you figure that out is by the part number on the camshaft. So with the camshafts out, you would have looked at the casting number. The number that's stamped on the front of the camshaft is going to be the final number. So this is a 911T, so these are a 03 on the camshaft. Our optimum timing for this camshaft is 2.5 millimeters of lift at TDC on our crank pulley. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to wind the engine over. And I've still got all my spark plugs out and the engine's nice and smooth, easy to wind over. I've got a fairly tight setting on my timing chain. And I'm going to watch my dial gauge. I went around 1 revolution. My dial gauge is a 1 millimeter per revolution. So I need to come around a 2nd revolution. And then I need to go 0.5 millimeters further. And I'm going to stop right there. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my crank pulley and see where my Z1 mark is. So I can see my Z1 is no longer lined up with the case. So I'm going to take off my cam nut, and I need to pull the pin out on my vernier wheel. So I'm just going to use my special tool to remove the timing pin. Pull that straight out. Now I'm going to realign my crank pulley. Now my dial gauge, my cam moved when I realigned my crank. So what I'm going to have to do is just use my camshaft holder and I want to bring that back around. Now it tends to want to move a little because we've only got 1 valve installed. If we had more valves installed, it would tend to want to stay put. So I'm just going to keep a hand on that, and then I'm just going to find a new location for my timing pin. Okay, there's my pin in. And we're going to go ahead and tighten that at this stage. So now we're going to tighten our camshaft nut. So I'm just going to put my cam holder on it. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to wind the engine back to TDC number 1 and make sure my dial gauge comes back up to 0. And if we need to make a small adjustment, which I'm off 0.01, I'm just going to correct for that. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to bring it around another 360 degrees of crankshaft, and we're going to recheck our timing. So there's 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters, and we are at 2.53 millimeters. So I've lined up my TDC marking with the crank, and what this means is the valve is open a depth of 2.5 millimeters at overlap. So when the piston is at all the way at the top, the valve is open. So this side is set and we're ready to go to the next side. So I'm going to go ahead and take my Z-block off now because we're done on this side. And I'm going to, before I wind the engine over, I'm going to go ahead and put our rocker in on cylinder number 4. So the same as the other side, we still want to have our 5 millimeter Allen wrench on the inside, but you'll notice that the thick boss is on this side and the thin boss is over here. So the rocker on this side is actually going to be in deeper, and we want to line up our rocker shaft over there. So I'm going to lubricate my camshaft again. And some oil on my pad. So you want to make sure that that rocker comes all the way through, and the edge of the rocker shaft, the boss, is flush with the cam box surface. So we're just going to tighten up our rocker shaft the same as we did on the other side. And we need to hold 8 millimeters on one side and a 5 millimeter on the inside. Make sure our rocker moves freely. And we're going to set valve clearance. So the same as on cylinder number 1, I need to reinstall my Z-block again and position it onto the valve retainer. And the same as we did on the other side, you want to make sure that it's got clearance on the cam box and away from the rocker so everything can move freely. And then I'm just going to go ahead and zero that. So I'm going to repeat the same process I did on the other side. We're already at TDC on number 4 because it's 180 degrees out from cylinder number 1. So all I need to do is bring it around to 2.5 millimeters. Now, when you're doing the second bank, it's more important to hit your best timing marks. You need to match the other side as closely as possible. So if I was at 2.7 millimeters on the other bank, I want this bank to be 2.7 millimeters. So there's 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters, and we were at 2.53, so we want to try and get as close to that as we possibly can. So the procedure is going to be the same. I'm slightly out on my TDC on my crank pulley. I'm going to remove the pin. Then I want to correct my crank pulley. And I can see my cam is moving, but I'm not too concerned about that just at the moment. Okay, because my cam moves slightly, I am going to just move it back. And we want a 253. So we're going to put the nut on and tighten the nut down again. So I'm just going to rotate the engine, bring my dial gauge back to 0. So I'm back on TDC. I want to recheck my dial gauge, and now we're going to recheck our timing. It's 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter. We are at 2.48. So it's about 0.05 of a millimeter off, which we would not be able to get that with changing a pin. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it. So that wraps it up for timing chain and installation and cam timing. Now all I have left to do is I need to install my chain tensioners. We're going to do that next, and then I can go ahead and install all of my valve rockers and adjust my valve clearance throughout the entire engine.